Okay, well, I think perhaps we should get started. So I wish you all a very warm welcome to this Roman Society lecture. And we are hugely lucky to have as our speaker this afternoon Tom Holland, who is known to you all, I'm sure, as author of the recently published Dynasty, widely celebrated, a gripping and erudite account of the Julio-Claudian emperors, from which, interestingly, Tiberius emerges as a somewhat unlikely hero, almost. So, you know, for those of you looking for the twist, that's an interesting Tiberian twist. Now, of course, it's been a wonderful autumn for Roman blockbuster works of Roman history. So there have been various reviews, glowing reviews of Tom's book, and some which have also reviewed Mary Beard's SPQR, which has also appeared this autumn, and William Dalrymple in the New Statesman, in a comment sure to boost Tom's sales figures, did observe, for those who prefer their Rome without testicle licking, Professor Beard may be the safer choice. And given some things that Tom said about this evening's lecture, I think that will be fully borne out. Now, in his review, William Dalrymple also likened Mary Beard to Augustus, that's an interesting one to think about, with Tom in the role of Mark Antony. Now, I'm not quite sure how far that parallel can be pressed, and I don't know if you necessarily want a second battle of Actium, but I do know, I can vouch for the fact that Tom, like Mark Antony, knows how to give a good party. Now, Tom is a Renaissance man. He's champion of the cricket pitch. He's an expert on dinosaurs and on hedgehogs, as well as commanding huge swathes of history. Greco-Roman enthusiasts will know his Rubicon, his book on the Roman Republic, as well as his earlier account of the Persian Wars, Persian Fire. He's also the author of Millennium, The End of the World and the Forging of Christendom. Also widely praised, though here as elsewhere, Tom is not one to dodge controversy. Tom's also a great linguist. His translation of Herodotus has met wide critical acclaim. Now, having translated Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars myself for Oxford World's Classics, I was filled with trepidation when I learned that Tom was working on a rival translation. And I'm only somewhat reassured to hear that that project is currently on the back burner, displaced by a biography of one of England's less well-known monarchs, dare I say it, King Athelstan, which is shortly to appear in the series of regal biographies on penguin monarchs. Tom is, of course, also the king of Twitter, and is often to be heard sharing his wide range of historical enthusiasms on BBC Radio, regularly featuring as presenter of Making History. So we're very lucky to have him speak to us this evening, and I'll hand over to you, Tom, to talk about whores and the House of Caesar.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's a particular pleasure for me to come here because the Classics Library here has been the absolute mainstay of my research ever since I began writing ancient history. So in some small way, I hope that tonight is an opportunity for me to repay that debt. And I am, of course, old enough, and I suspect, I may be wrong here, but I suspect that some of you as well may be old enough to remember the time when a Classics Library was the surest way of getting hold of some real quality filth. As an O-level student, we did a very Bowdlerised version of Catullus, but I only realised just how Bowdlerised it had been when, having finished O-level and getting the Loeb off the shelf, I discovered just what delights had been left out of the syllabus. And that was the time when anything rude, I think in a Latin Loeb, rather than putting it into English, they'd put it into Greek. And I think in the Greek ones, if they had anything rude, for some reason they put it into Italian, which was sort of wonderful commentary on what they thought about the Italians. But of course, from Catullus, it was a short step to Suetonius, who absolutely guaranteed repository of filth. And it is probably the one thing that almost everyone knows about the Roman Empire, even those who have no particular interest in it, is that the early Caesars, people with names like Tiberius, we've heard mentioned, Caligula, probably, well, certainly one of the few people who is as well known to pornographers as to classicists. This is from the Italian film poster of the, back to the Italians again, and shows that Berlusconi's bunga parties had a sort of long and honourable tradition. But this quality, the fact that a significant period of classical history has provided grist to the mill of soft porn manufacturers, has over, I think for many scholars, been a slight cause of embarrassment. And also a cause of awkwardness, because, of course, when one reads the stories that are told about these emperors, Tiberius and testicle-licking Catherine mentioned, but Nero marrying eunuchs, Caligula and his sisters, the difficulty is to know what to make of them. Are these stories in any way true? What relationship do they bear to what might actually have happened in the 1st century AD? And it's a problem, of course, that was recognised and acknowledged by Roman historians themselves, most famously by Tacitus, who, right in the opening of the Annals, is absolutely upfront about the problem that he faces when he says that the histories of Tiberius and Caligula, of Claudius and Nero, were falsified while they remained alive out of dread, and then after their deaths were composed under the influence of still festering hatreds. And so traditionally the response to this has been twofold. On the one hand, there is the response of novelists, of filmmakers, of pornographers, who say, wonderful, we'll just reproduce this, we won't worry about whether it's true or not, it's a great story, let's go for it. And then, of course, there is the response of scholars, which is to recognise that as narratives, often these stories that are told about the Julio-Claudians are deeply problematic, and to focus instead on the politics of immorality, to recognise that these are tropes. And Catherine's book on this has been a huge inspiration to me since long before I wrote Rubicon. It's one of the things that made me want to write ancient history. But as someone who is writing for a general audience, for an audience that is not primarily composed of classical scholars, I have to tread a middle line. I have to give people a story, but I also have to recognise that these stories are problematic. And so the challenge that I found, particularly in writing about the Julio-Claudians, more perhaps than any other field of ancient history that I've written about, is how to walk that tightrope between the desire to tell a story and a recognition that sometimes the stories may just be too good to be true. And the problem, of course, when writing about this topic for a general audience is that the layers of varnish that have been applied to these figures, to Caligula, to Nero, and so on, did not stop with the Romans, did not stop with Tacitus and Suetonius, that they have continued to be applied ever since. Everywhere I've gone to talk about this book, at this stage I have asked people to put their hands up if they've read I Claudius or watched it. And almost everywhere I go, there is a forest of hands. This, of course, is from the BBC adaptation of I Claudius. It's quite possibly my favourite scene because it's so very, very 70s. It's what could probably unclassically be described as the bonkathon between Messalina and Scylla, the Sicilian whirlpool, who in the BBC adaptation is introduced as the president of the Prostitutes' Union of Rome, and she has been brought in to see which of the two can sleep with the most men without break. And as you can see, she is at least as Penelope Keith as she is Roman. She has the look of a 70s sitcom character. And her dialogue, likewise, has a 70s sitcom character to it. The difference between this great lady, she says in the adaptation, pointing to Messalina, and myself, is that my work is her hobby. My hobby happens to be gardening. could be from the good life. And of course, the other wonderful 70s aspect of it is that she's the president of the Prostitutes' Union. So sort of the implication that she might at any point go on strike and join the Winter of Discontent or something. She's not the president of the Prostitutes' Union in Graves's novel, Claudius the God. She is there. She is the, what is she? She is the, yes, she's the president of the Prostitutes' Guild. Graves tells us that she retires after having slept with 25 men, but that Messalina carries on while until the sun is high in the sky. And Graves, in turn, was responding to a tradition that cast Messalina as the absolute archetype of high-born depravity. That's what really gets people. It's the contrast between the status that Messalina has as the wife of Claudius, as Caesar's wife, and the fact that she is prostituting herself on the streets. And this is Aubrey Beardsley, frankly terrifying vision of what Messalina might have been like, and all the more so for the fact that Michael Jackson appears to be lurking in the background. And Beardsley, in turn, of course, is drawing on classical texts, and two in particular. The first is from Pliny the Elder's account of reproduction, book 10, in which he magnificently introduces, I'm sure you will remember, but if you don't, he introduces the section on human reproduction with the comment that man is the only animal whose first experience of copulation is followed by regret, which makes you feel rather sorry for Pliny, and maybe for Mrs. Pliny as well, who knows. And then he goes straight into the detail of Messalina, and he describes her as the most notorious of whores, and he says that it went on for 24 hours. But of course, the person who, the writer who really puts the stake through the heart of Messalina's reputation is Juvenal, who, in his great satire on women, Messalina plays leading part. Again, I'm sure you all remember, but Juvenal describes Messalina lying in bed with Claudius, waiting for him to go to sleep, then slipping off, gilding her nipples, putting on the blonde wig, heading down to the very reddest of Rome's red light districts, and there offering herself up to whoever, the lowest of the low, whoever wants to buy her. And it's all clearly brilliantly thrilling stuff, and the fact that she remains a byword to this day suggests the degree to which this story clearly appeals to something quite fundamental, certainly in male sexual fantasy. But it does leave hanging this question of what is going on here. And the problem is intense for a number of reasons. The first is, of course, that it's the nature of a court, which is what, over the course of the Julio-Claudian period, the Palatine increasingly becomes. It's the nature of court that often significant things will happen behind closed doors. And the Romans themselves, of course, appreciated this. They understood that at the heart of the dynasty founded by Augustus, there was a kind of darkness that mocked and defied their efforts to penetrate it. They understood that public affairs were no longer public, that the res was no longer publica. And they understood that speeches that were given in the Senate or to the people in the forum, in the comitia, that these were no longer as liable to sway the affairs of the state as they had been in the days before the coming to power of Augustus. And the classic expression of this was given by Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, that from then on, so from the coming to power of Augustus, things began to be done secretly and in such a way as not to be made public. And so there was this abiding sense that no one could see behind the front that was put up by Augustus. Then there was a further complication, and that was that, maybe the Romans weren't exceptional for their love of gossip, but I think reading them, you get the sense that they, well, Catherine mentioned Twitter. I mean, they would have loved Twitter. They would have loved Facebook. They would have loved the opportunity to go online and bitch about people. It's not for nothing that it's the Romans who invent satire as a genre. And I suppose the most wonderful expression of this enthusiasm for basically for being rude about people is that line on the basilica in Pompeii where it says, you know, wall, you've got so much graffiti written on you that I'm amazed you haven't collapsed beneath the weight of it. And of course, even the illiterate would make sure to express their opinion of people. It was a kind of nagging anxiety among the great men of Rome that if they put up a monument and people didn't approve of them, they would go and defecate or urinate over the statue. So you'd go and look at your statue to see, you know, to admire it, and you'd notice sort of slash marks across it or great piles of turds, and you'd know that people had been bitching about you. So it's not surprising that Virgil, of course, famously describes rumour, gossip, than which no evil is faster. And that is something that we too are thoroughly familiar with. It was hugely helpful that while I was absolutely in the teeth of promoting this book, the story broke about what the Prime Minister was supposed to have been getting up to in his exclusive dining society at Oxford while a student. Now, almost certainly, as it turns out, this story wasn't true, but that didn't stop everyone enjoying it hugely, and it added to the gaiety of the nation. But of course, there was also the strong sense that even if it wasn't true, it did express something significant about how people saw the Prime Minister. It was kind of believed because it was believable. And that, of course, as Catherine brilliantly demonstrated, is one of the key salient aspects of these seemingly remarkable stories that are told about the Julio-Claudians. That they are told because they seem to draw on the wellsprings of what might be plausible. Now, clearly, something about Messalina fueled the rumours and the stories that were told about her. And the thing is, of course, that it's not just Messalina. It's pretty much Julio-Claudian powerful women, full stop. In fact, it's hard to think of any who at some point were not accused of, if not prostitution, then adultery, and you know, several were accused of both. And I suppose the one exception actually proves the rule. This, of course, is Livia, who, yes, scandal attaches to her when she first marries the future Augustus. She's pregnant at the time with Drusus, who will be her second son. She married Claudian, who divorces her so that she can then marry the future Augustus, and there is a definite whiff of scandal around that. But from that point on, Livia is a shining model of rectitude. She never appears in public without the stola over her head. She's the image of pious duty. And in due course, she reaps spectacular rewards. She gets the name Augusta when Augustus is dead. She is awarded male privileges to a degree that no woman before her had ever been awarded them. So she's given lictors and she's given priesthoods. And in due course, after her death, when Claudius comes to power, she's made a goddess. But of course, as everyone who has read or watched I, Claudius knows, there were rumours that attached themselves to Livia as well. They were not about sexual impropriety, but they were about her facility with the poison box. And again, this is drawing on standard tropes within Roman society, a society in which there were a lot more stepmothers than there are in our society. And in which stepmothers were invariably assumed to be going around poisoning the children of their stepchildren. So essentially, you know, if you're a Julia Claudian woman, if you're not being accused of adultery or prostitution, you're being accused of poisoning. And when one is writing the story of the Julia Claudians, one has to face fair and square this question, you know, were they all just uber bitches? Were they all these appalling monsters of depravity? Well, what is very evident is that the fact that they are being accused of being monsters of depravity is in itself significant, that there is an understanding of depravity. There is definitely, certainly not here I know in the Roman society, but out there is a sense that the Romans in this period were just shamelessly decadent, and that they just were doing revolting things at the absolute drop of a hat, and they had absolutely no morality. But of course that is not the case at all. The Romans were deeply moral, in fact puritanical people in many ways, and we only know about these reputed crimes, these reputed orgies, these reputed displays of nymphomania because moralists are so keen to condemn them. And the implication of that in turn is that it did matter very much to rulers to seem moral. And the prototype of that, of course, is Livia's husband, Augustus, for whom morality was a fundamental strand of the package that he embodied. Now, he was certainly murderous. He was clearly a deeply unpleasant and violent man when given incentive. Before he becomes 20, he has raised a private army, he has made himself consul at the point of the sword, and he has joined in the fun of the proscriptions and cheerily dispatched vast swathes of the Roman elite to murderous deaths. And he is not just doing this, he's not just giving the orders. There are stories that are told of him in which he himself is displayed as violent. There is a story of an assassin being discovered, brought in front of the future Augustus, who places his thumbs over the accused man's eyes and gouges them out. And yet, once Augustus has become Augustus, once he has reached the plateau of relative security, once Mark Antony, my doppelganger, has been disposed of, then he presents himself as an absolute model of morality, as a prince of peace. That is essentially what the name Augustus is designed to evoke. And it is in that role that Augustus plays the role of censor, the most senior magistrate in the old republican system, and it is with that license that he introduces in 18 BC something very novel, the idea that a Roman magistrate, in this case Augustus, might have the right to poke his nose into what people are getting up to in their bedrooms when he essentially criminalises adultery. And of course, as is invariably the case when men criminalise sexual behaviour, it's women who generally bear the brunt of this legislation, and it's decreed that women caught committing adultery should be exiled to an island, that they should be obliged to dress like a prostitute, that they should be registered among the infame, so not just prostitutes, not just madams, but absolutely the lowest of the low actresses. That bad. And in due course, as we remember, those of us who lived through John Major's drive to get back to basics, governments that pose as moralists invariably get caught up, and people always kind of enjoy it. And 2 BC, Julia, his daughter, is accused of adultery and indeed of prostituting herself in the Roman Forum, beneath the rostra from which her father was wont to address the Roman people. She is convicted, and the full force of Augustan law falls on her head, and she is exiled to an island. Now, so what's going on there? It's the first great sex scandal of the Augustan, indeed the Julia Claudian age, and is in many ways kind of archetypal. There is a sense, perhaps, in which it serves as a parody of Augustan legislation. That element of Schadenfreude is certainly there to a degree, although Julia is very popular with the mass of people who are very upset at what happens to her. Then there is the hint of the political. The person with whom Julia has been supposedly committing adultery is Iulus Antonius, the son of Antony, who's been brought up in Augustus's household. We are told that flowers were being set on the head of Marsyas, the symbol of a traditional symbol of popular liberty, stood in the forum beneath which again Julia is supposed to have been prostituting herself. And then again there is the likelihood this might be true, because it does seem to correspond to stories and anecdotes and quotes that are applied to Julia. Now often these quotes are very late, but they seem to, even if they're not true, they seem to convey the way in which Julia might indeed have made herself popular among the people. There's a sort of wonderful one about, she's married to Agrippa, and she's asked how the stories could possibly be true that she cheated on Agrippa when her sons looked just like him, and Julia says, why? Because I only ever take on passengers after the cargo hold has been loaded. Which I think's not bad as a joke. I mean, you usually get to titter. And in that sense, she is the presiding genius of the kind of culture of chic metrosexuality, of which Ovid is the great laureate. And it's telling, of course, that in due course Ovid himself will be caught up in a sex scandal that engulfs Julia's daughter, infuriatingly also called Julia. Makes it very difficult writing a narrative history, I can tell you. Julia the younger, like her mother, gets caught up in a scandal that seems to be political in its implications, and Ovid, of course, is embroiled in it as well, and all we know is that Carmen, so his poetry, presumably writing about the pleasures of love, et error. We don't know what that is, but probably something political. But certainly it becomes immediately evident from these two incipient sex scandals is that fast living is certainly an option for the elite, for the fast set, but it is dangerous. And it's dangerous because morality is significant to Augustus. He does, I think, see himself as authentically moral. And so too does the man who succeeds him, Tiberius, and here he is with Mummy. Fit image of the austerity, which really seems to be the keynote of Tiberius's character. He is, of course, head of the Claudians, so he is vastly more William Rees Moggish than Augustus ever was, austere, conservative. And he, in a sense, embodies far more convincingly than Augustus ever could the grand tradition of the stiff upper lip that the Roman aristocracy at its most austere like to think of itself as embodying. And I suppose the story that best exemplifies that, and the degree to which having a stiff upper lip for an aristocrat was in itself a political statement of where you stood relative to the vast mass of the people, is the story that is told of what Tiberius does when the news is brought to him of the accident that has happened to his brother Drusus. Tiberius at the time is in Pannonia, Drusus is in Germania. Tiberius gets on a horse and gallops through enemy territory to be with his brother, who then dies in his arms. Tiberius escorts him back to Rome. It's all absolutely like something from the early pages of Livy. This is thrillingly echt Roman. But when Tiberius arrives outside Rome, the people come out to mourn Drusus, who is their favourite. Tiberius, not a hint of a tear. and there's a real sort of whiff of Princess Diana about this. The sort of, you know, come on Tiberius, show us you care. He's not going to show he cares. He despises displays of emotion. And that refusal to indulge the people's taste for emotional excess marks out the degree to which Tiberius is a conservative figure. He is not a popularis. He is pledged to the dignity of the Senate, to the ideals of the aristocracy, to the virtues of his city's past. And there is a sense, I think, in which the Principate of Tiberius is the concluding bout in the Great War between the popularis tradition and the optimate tradition that had been going on throughout the previous century. And Tiberius is the one who really nails it. You know, he finishes off popular elections, he completes the temple that had been begun when the Gracchi were killed. And he certainly sees himself as the defender of senatorial rights. But the problem is, of course, that he is simultaneously an autocrat. And the senators, although they, you know, are perfectly keen to be flattered by him and told that they are the guardians of Roman morality and tradition, nevertheless, they don't quite know what that means in practical terms. And I think that in the end, it breaks Tiberius. I think that's probably the likeliest reason why he just sort of throws up his hands and retires to Capri, where he, of course, spends the last 10 years of his life. Now, while he is on Capri, the Roman Empire continues to function very effectively. Governors who are reasonably competent remain in place. The frontiers hold. Tiberius, throughout his military career, had always been a great one for stabilising frontiers. He did it in Pannonia, he did it most notably after the defeat of Varus in AD 9 along the Rhine frontier. And the Roman world is at peace. And to provincials, he appears a kind of Prospero figure. Not just a person who is maintaining the order of the world, but someone with an intimate understanding of the relationship, the proper relationship between men and gods. Philo is the person who really sums this perspective up by saying, for wisdom and erudition, there is nobody of his generation to compare, which is quite a eulogy coming from Philo. But of course, there is a different perspective, and it is the different perspective that has come to dominate Tiberius's posthumous reputation, because the different perspective is bred of the deep-seated Roman presumption that a desire for privacy is in some sense a confession of perverted, probably sexual desires, that someone who wants not to be watched, not to have their behaviour monitored, must be up to no good. And so you get all the, you know, the testicle licking and other stories that are so repulsive that even to an audience of educated classicists, I hesitate to quote them. But they are in the book, so, and they're in Catherine's translation of Suetonius. And we simply have no idea whether the stories, these stories are true or not. The best that one can do is to look at them and put them in the broader perspective, the perspective of maybe of what's gone before, but also what follows on. And in that light, I think that possibly the most interesting story that is told about Tiberius is that he is particularly fond of watching pornographic tableau. And interesting on a number of levels. Interesting because we're told that these pornographic tableau were inspired by mythology. And one of the reasons why Tiberius has his reputation as someone who knows about the gods is that it is known that he is very, very interested in mythology. And actually there is a sense in which probably his private life on Capri did not revolve around orgies, but around sort of rather severe equivalents of pub quizzes, and scholars would be invited to dinner, and he'd serve them up. So he was notorious for his taste for vegetables that certainly epicures did not regard as the height of luxury, and he'd serve them these vegetables and then grill them on what name Achilles had used when he was disguised as a girl, or what song the siren sang, and if you didn't measure up, you'd be out. So it's sort of interesting that we're told that these sexual tableaux have a mythological dimension. We are also told that the people who take part in these tableaux are aristocratic. Tacitus specifies that beauty and good bodies, uncorrupted innocence and distinguished ancestry, these were what turned him on. Now, that might seem paradoxical because, of course, Tiberius had devoted his entire life to upholding the dignity of the aristocracy. But the perspective that one might be turned on by what is forbidden is not original to Freud. Ovid, absolute pathologist of the erotic, had completely understood that. Desire is fueled by prohibition, he commented at one point. And of course, from Tiberius' own perspective, if the stories are true, the choice of performers could hardly have been more transgressive. Because to have these young men, these young women who are the embodiments of everything that Tiberius is supposed to hold sacred, to have them in front of him and to watch them perform like the kind of the lowest kind of streetwalker, it's an absolute hideous desecration of everything that he had ever held dear. And it's possible, on the psychological level, that perhaps for the princeps that was precisely the point. Now, that's still not enough, I think, to answer the question, was this true or not? But there is one further dimension, and that is that Tiberius was not alone on Capri. He had the man who would turn out to be his successor, Gaius Caligula, with him. And we're told about Caligula that he enjoyed watching and directing and participating in these pornographic floor shows very much. Manifold though his vices were, his truest bent was for abuse, and these floor shows supposedly were the first demonstration of this. And again, if true, then it revealed something about Caligula's character, namely that he had a great taste for the dramatic, for dressing up, for the flamboyant, and that he positively enjoyed hurting and humiliating people. And again, one might dismiss this as the kind of rumour-mongering that Roman gossip was always liable to come up with, were it not for the fact that when Caligula becomes emperor, it does seem that he translates these characteristics that on Capri had been held in private onto the broadest stage of all, namely Rome. And Caligula's policy, which in many ways is the diametric opposite of that of Augustus and Tiberius, and I'm sure pointedly so, was to annihilate the status of the Senate, because Caligula, as an autocrat who owed nothing to the Republic, in his opinion, was determined that he was not going to owe anything to the Senate. He wanted to rule as an autocrat, and therefore he was determined to base his authority in the love of the people. And therefore it gave him great pleasure, politically and who knows, maybe emotionally as well, to diss the Senate as much as he possibly could. And in that light, there is a sort of culminating indignity that he imposes on the senatorial elite, we are told, is that he takes the wives, the daughters and the sons of the leading men in Rome as hostage, puts them on the Palatine, and there they are, essentially prostituted. Most scholars doubt that that actually happened, but the echo of what is supposed to have happened on Capri is an intriguing one, and suggests that even if not true, the idea that there is this nexus between the humiliation of rank and prostitution is a theme that is there waiting to be used for whatever political purpose, whether to blacken Caligula's name or perhaps being used by Caligula himself to really humiliate his political enemies. Now, of course, in due course, Caligula discovers that actually there are limits set on his autocracy, and those limits are set by the threat of assassination. He gets killed and is replaced by Claudius. And Claudius is an altogether, he's a figure who has a kind of respect for the traditions of Rome that Caligula had not had. Claudius, of course, was a historian. He had a particular interest in the origins of Roman and indeed Etruscan customs, and he seems to have been pledged to an idea that his role as emperor was a bit like Augustus had done and Tiberius, was to uphold the bond between the present day and the ancient traditions of his people. But he, again, as happens throughout this period, the very attempt to uphold morality makes you vulnerable to gossip, because the moment you're standing up for a particular form of behaviour, people always want to start gossiping about it and using it to smear you. And this is particularly so because of the circumstances in which he's come to power. He's come to power on the back of a coup. He does not have the blood of Augustus in his veins, nor has he been adopted by Augustus, so he is the first emperor who has to take on the title of Caesar, not as sort of, you know, part of his family name, but as a title. And so that means that Claudius is unusually dependent for status on his wife, Messalina, who does have the blood of Augustus in her veins, and who becomes the mother of Claudius's son and heir, little Britannicus. And here she is, as she wanted to be seen again, with the stole over her head, posing, frankly, intimidating figure. And she was able to use her significance to Claudius. She was able to leverage the fact that she was clearly a very able and intimidating figure in her own right, to make herself, by the standards, the relative standards, even of the most powerful woman, nevertheless, clearly a player in the Julio-Claudian court, the Claudian court. And as such, to the average Roman, and indeed maybe to senators as well, who knows, but certainly to the average Roman, the idea of a powerful woman, a woman who is able to put men in their place, this seems to have fueled all kinds of erotic fantasies. She stalks fantasies, it seems, as well as fears. And this makes her vulnerable. And it makes her vulnerable because Claudius, as well as having a dependency on his wife, so it is said, was also notorious for being dependent on former slaves, on freedmen, people from his own household. He was anxious that the circumstances by which he'd come to power rendered him inherently unpopular with the Senate. And so as a result, the stories were that he was more than any earlier emperor was dependent on freedmen, and these freedmen often, it was said, had a power and a rank that was greater than that even of a consul. And we can tell that freedmen did have a status, did have a power, because the story goes that Messalina seduced one of them. And the obvious implication is that this story would not have been told had it not been considered worth seducing him. Again, we don't know whether Messalina really did seduce a freedman, but the fact that this story was told tells us something about the status of freedmen, how it was understood. Now, Messalina is also said, this slave, this freedman that she slept with, then said to have gone out and had him destroyed. But there was one freedman whom she did not destroy. And this was unfortunate for her because the freedman, Narcissus, was a figure of great power under Claudius, and their mutual loathing, their mutual struggle to command the ear of Caesar, seems in the long run, I think, to have precipitated the great crisis of Claudius's reign. Now, the story goes that Messalina was so much the creature of her own lusts that she gave herself over completely to the most handsome man in the Senate, a chap called Gaius Silius. And she decided that she'd had enough of the twitching, dribbling Claudius, and she wanted to marry him, and sure enough, she stages the ceremony and becomes his wife. And this is reported to Claudius, who understandably is a bit pissed off about it, and basically has her eliminated. And it's an extraordinary story, and it was recognised by the Romans themselves to have been extraordinary, and it puzzled them. And they wondered why it was that someone so powerful, someone who was the mother of the future emperor, the wife of Caesar, would have risked everything simply to have a fling with this guy, Gaius Silius. And certainly the explanation was that Messalina was indeed the absolute model of promiscuity, and it's this that feeds into the later tradition. But, and this is kind of where the area of speculation comes in, and this is the area of speculation that certainly, I'm sure Catherine in Politics of Immorality would you don't probe a trope, but I'm going to probe a trope here. When you look at the story as it is told in Tacitus, what you do notice is that it has the fingerprints of Narcissus all over it. How is Claudius told about what has been going on? Well, Tacitus says that 2 of his concubines are sent in to tell him, and the person who pushes them in is Narcissus. Then we're told Claudius has been down at Ostia developing the deep sea port down there. He obviously wants to go back to Rome, so he gets in his carriage and is rattling along, and he asks 2 companions, both of them senators, what do you think is going on? And they hum and ha and prevaricate. Narcissus is also there, we're told, and he says, yeah, she's a whore, killer. They pull up outside Rome. Messalina comes out with her children to try and appeal to his better nature. It's Narcissus who shouts them down. And then when they arrive in Rome, astonishingly, it is Narcissus, we're told, who takes control of the Praetorians and who ensures that everyone involved in the plot, so not just Gaius Silius, not just Messalina, but anyone who might contradict the story that he has been telling, they are all wiped out. And of course, the corollary of that is that once everyone has been wiped out, once the corpses have been dragged away, once the blood has dried, there is no one left to contradict the story that Narcissus may well have completely manufactured. Now, obviously, it's impossible to know for sure whether that is what happened. It's just, it's a thesis. But one of the joys, actually, of this period is that when you look at these stories, there is, I think, just enough evidence, if you put it in the context of the broad sweep of history, every so often to arrive at I think, a plausible conclusion as to what might have been going on. And it is that aspect of the detective story about it that I think enhances the fascination of this remarkable and quite gloriously scandalous period of history. Thanks very much. Happy to take. Have you got time for questions or not?
I think we have, if you're willing to take
Yes.
questions. Well, thank you so much, first of all, Tom, for a splendid talk probing some of the darker byways of Roman imperial history, and some very memorable images there of defiled statues and all sorts of other things. Do we have any questions? Yes.
That was absolutely brilliant. I'm really glad I came along. I wish I'd brought some people with me. I was waiting for you to go on to Nero and Agrippina. That would have been a real wrong as well. Around that time.
Bless them. Do you want me to talk about Nero?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, that's the end of the Julian
as I say,
story.
I am writing. I wrote this book to be read for pleasure by people who may not necessarily know much about the subject. And it was, I was therefore anxious in the way that perhaps a novelist might be, not to overdo it and think, oh God, are people just going to be exhausted by this stage of all the sort of depravity and murder? Is Nero going to let me down? No, he didn't. He was so wonderful, so monstrously grotesque, by miles the most enjoyable person I've ever written about. And I would get up every morning and think, I'm writing about Nero! Come on, what have you got for me today? And he'd always have something brilliantly appalling. And I'd get to the evening, and usually, after the hard day's writing, you just want to slump. But I just think, I just want to carry on with this. And the reason for that, I think, is that, when Nero says qualis artifex, as he has himself killed, the self-consciousness with which Nero presents his crimes and his depravities is what really marks him out. There is a kind of jouissance about it, a murderous jouissance about it, that means that in some ways he kind of serves as a parody of everything that's gone before, but also as a refinement of it. And the appeal of that is reflected in the fact that after he dies, although of course he is excoriated by Roman senatorial tradition and of course by Christian tradition, which has ensured that he remain, to this day, he, possibly even more than Caligula, he is the absolute embodiment of the mad emperor. There are these other traditions that are reflected in the fact that flowers are being left on his grave, that people, after his death, would appear in the East and claim to be Nero. You don't do that unless there's some value in laying claim to the person you are mimicking. And the most astonishing reflection of the esteem in which Nero is held by certain sections of Roman, certain provincial society, is the fact that he appears in the Talmud as a convert to Judaism, that he faked his death, converts to Judaism, and I think is the great-grandfather of one of the key rabbis in the Talmud. Very different perspective on the number of the beast kind of monster that certainly is preserved in the Tacitean and the biblical tradition. He's great. Awful, but great. Any other?
Well, now we know Nero is a good guy, which is great. The thing I always find curious about this period is that we all know that most monarchs, many dictators, are depraved, corrupt, and full of scandal. But is the way that in this case their successors talk about it so openly and so much, whereas normally the ruling family's successors come together and don't make a point of talking about the depravity of their predecessors.
The real depravity is associated with Caligula and with Nero, and having talked about Tiberius as the great enemy of the popularist tradition, there's a sense, I think, in which Caligula and Nero are both using that inheritance. The idea that you measure yourself by the approbation of the people, and that you give them what they want, and it's kind of it's kind of noticeable that both Caligula and Nero are strongly associated with chariot racing. They lay on chariot racing, but they also race chariots themselves. Caligula, I think, is 6 horses, isn't he? He's the first. He drives a 6-horse chariot for the first time, and they all absolutely love it. And then, of course, in the Olympic Games, Nero races with 12 horses. And famously, he is thrown from his chariot, and they bring on another chariot, and he ends up winning. And traditionally, everyone has a good laugh about this and says, "Oh, no, it's all fake." Not at all. To be thrown from a chariot and to have the wheels slicing past you and the hooves of the horses hammering down, and then to get back into a chariot and complete the race. I mean, that takes incredible courage. So I think that there is a kind of sense in which, this is the equivalent of it's Formula One. It's driving the sports car. It's behaving in the way that a normal person would expect someone with all the power in the world to behave. that you're not making yourself the embodiment of stuffy duty and responsibility. You are kind of getting out there and doing what a fast-living, fun-loving guy should do. And in that sense, I think that Caligula and Nero are taking that popularist tradition and pushing it to the absolute limits, which of course then makes them unpopular, obviously, with the whole senatorial class who tend to write the history books. No one cares to bend them?
I think perhaps, yeah, we should let you have a drink now, a very well-deserved drink. So, but before we thank Tom very warmly for that splendid lecture, can I just draw your attention to our forthcoming events? In February, 3rd of February, we have Professor Jean-Louis Ferrari talking about Quintus Mucius Scaevola and Roman political life in the 90s BC. And then on Tuesday, the 8th of March, we've got an event on Dura Europus, introduced and chaired by Professor Simon James, with Professor Pierre Leriche talking about the new image of Europus Dura on the Euphrates, and Dr. Jen Baird talking about photographs of Dura. Now let us return to this evening and thank Tom very much indeed for a really fantastic lecture, really stimulating, and it's given us all a lot to think about, as well as being very entertaining, and hope he may be open to further questions over drinks, to which you're all now warmly invited. So thank you very much, Tom.